Yesterday, I was brainstorming on some ideas for this show, trying to come up with different topics to talk about here. And I came across the concept of deliberate practice. And I remembered reading about that in a book called The Talent Code a while back. And I thought it would be cool to talk about here because the idea, the concept of deliberate practice is, I don't know if it's the best or one of the best ways to sort of fast track your progress on anything you want to do, any skills you want to develop. So you can apply this to graffiti or, if you want to change up your style or try some new shit or, different art stuff. If you want to just try different techniques, it could apply to learning technical skills like computer shit. I don't know. I have a bunch of examples. Well, not a bunch. I have a few where I can remember in my life where I wasn't aware of the concept of deliberate practice, but in retrospect, when I go through all of this stuff, I noticed that I was actually doing this. So I'm not sure what the best structure. I have a bullet point here, a bullet point list, but then I also have some examples. Let's see here. I'm trying to decide. I'll just start going through the bullet points, and then as the examples fit, I'll throw them in there. So these bullet points kind of outline sort of how you can utilize deliberate practice. And the reason that I think it's important, I think I said this already, I don't remember, is it'll greatly shorten the timeline in at least getting started or making a lot of progress in a short amount of time. So the idea of deliberate practice is pretty much what it sounds like. It's just a way of practicing with intention, focusing completely on what you're doing, cutting out distractions and all this kind of stuff, and just really, it's like if you're trying to learn the guitar and just every now and then you pick up the guitar and you're kind of just fucking around while you're watching TV, you're probably going to generate some skills. But if you shut everything else out and 100% focus on every single thing you're doing with the guitar and all that stuff, where your fingers are landing, all this shit, if you really, really, really focus on it, you're going to make a lot more gains a lot faster. So let's just start going through these bullet points and then I'll figure out where to put in these examples. So bullet point 1, well-defined specific goals. This is something that in the examples that I'll give you, I can remember. Actually, the first example I could tie into this is when I was in college, I had an assignment. I was taking a motion graphics class, and at the time I only knew how to do 2D animation. So I was doing things in After Effects. I hadn't got into 3D. I ended up later getting really into 3D animation and modeling and doing most of my work in 3D, most of my professional work for TV shows and things like that. Utilize 3D, of course, not I'm not talking to a fucking motion graphics audience, but some of you might know this, but everything ends up in 2D at some point. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point, but all I really knew how to do was 2D animation. So we had an assignment and I created this animation. It was some sort of thing with ants going through like an ant hill. And the instructor said, what would be really cool is if we could see this ant turn a corner, like go back into Z space. And that would require 3D. And so at the time I didn't know how to do 3D. And these classes are structured that you show the assignment and then by that same day, next week, you show an updated version of that assignment based on the notes. The only way to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish was to learn 3D and learn how to animate and model and do all of that stuff and create a new version of the assignment all in the course of 1 week. And this particular motion graphics class was an elective class, so it wasn't even one of my main classes. And in the art school that I went to, really your main classes are the most important. You really can't fuck those up. It was like graphic design and typography and different, I think those were the two big ones. And then there was some other kind of main courses. And then everything else was sort of like, you obviously had to finish everything, but it wasn't nearly as important. So it wasn't like I had that whole 7 days to commit to just that one assignment. So I really had to fast track my progress in a very, very short amount of time. So I had 7 days to complete it, but with all my other workload, realistically, I think I probably only had hard to say, but maybe like 20 hours to commit to it. And that's with like cutting into my sleeping time and shit. So anyway, that's what I did. I just focused 100% of what time I had outside of my normal shit to learning how to do 3D. Obviously, like in that setting, you know, you're around a lot of other people that are doing shit. So I was able to ask questions to other people. But I didn't know I was doing this at the time, but I was doing that sort of deliberate practice. And I had a well-defined specific goal because I needed to get this thing done within a specific timeline. And I knew exactly what it was that I was trying to do. These other bullet points that I have in here also apply to this. So the next one is focused and attentive practice. So that the only way to accomplish that goal in that short amount of time was it required a great deal of focus. So when I was working on that assignment, I couldn't, and this was before social media and all that, and phones were just phones at the time. So it was a little easier, but at the same time, you're in a room full of your peers and like there's a lot of drinking and partying and all this kind of stuff. So I had to like tune out a lot of that shit and focus 100%. The next one is a feedback loop. So one thing about our brains is my understanding, you know, we talk about dopamine and things like that. You get rewarded as you start to see progress. So that's where the feedback loop comes in. So let's say you have a well-defined specific goal. You have focused and attentive practice. So you're 100% focused. You know what generally what the outcome that you would like to achieve. And then you need a feedback loop because as you're sitting there focusing and doing this stuff, imagine if you never really saw any progress and you never got any small wins along the way. It would be pretty discouraging. And our brains are sort of designed so that you get some kind of reward as you're going in the form of dopamine. So like for me, it's hard to remember exactly what those things were, but I would imagine that while I was doing it, as soon as something clicked and I'm like, oh shit, that worked. Now I know how to do that. My brain probably released a little bit of dopamine, and that sort of trains your brain to want to keep going and moving down the path. So the other thing on the bullet point, stepping outside of your comfort zone, that obviously that's exactly what I was doing. I was trying to learn a whole new way of animating and designing and 3D modeling and all that stuff in a very short amount of time. So I was way outside of my comfort zone. So all of that stuff sort of ties in together when you think about it. If you're outside of your comfort zone and you're getting quick wins along the way, that feels good. It's exciting, you know. I'm going to talk about some graph stuff too as I go through this, but that's just the one I landed on first. So the next one, I don't think I did do this. It's structured practice routines. I'm really bad about doing things like that. So I've never actually incorporated that, but I can see that if I could see that being something that I could use nowadays with so much distractions. You know, my business is pulling me in so many different directions, and in my mind, I feel like I'm juggling bowling balls, and people are adding more bowling balls, and I'm at risk of getting hit in the face by one at all times. You know, so having some sort of structured practice routine would probably be really helpful if I was trying to develop. Well, I am always trying to develop skills, so maybe I'll incorporate that. But I don't really have any examples. But that makes a lot of sense. Carefully planning out and putting them in your calendar and when you're going to actually practice and make sure you're holding yourself accountable. I could see that being highly beneficial. The next bullet point, I also don't think I'm very good at this, is considering the sustainability. So if you're going to sort of force yourself to get into this really deep focus, deliberate practice and try to accomplish something in a short amount of time, one might say that considering how sustainable I guess I do this, and actually this weekend is a good example. I still worked, but I just sort of stepped back a small amount so that I can kind of recoup my energy. You know, the idea of deliberate practice is it's pretty intense if you're really doing it 100%. So considering how sustainable it is, there's another example that I'll give. So later in my career, when I was doing motion graphics professionally, I would have downtime. So a lot of times when we would do a big project, a lot of times maybe there was a couple weeks before anything else came in after that. So a lot of times I would sort of relax for a day or two, and then I would use that time to either develop new skills or maybe cut a new reel or do something that kept me working so I didn't completely lose my momentum. One of the times, so the other thing about the television industry, when I was doing this, the companies that I worked for, and this was pretty common, they would pretty much go dark for, I think it was like 2 weeks around Christmas and New Year. So every year there was like 2 weeks where you weren't going to hear from anybody. Like you won't get any phone calls, nothing. So a lot of times what I would do is I would use those 2 weeks to enhance my skills and learn some different shit, some different techniques and stuff like that. And I was doing a lot of graphics for these sort of like reality shows that are informational or something like that, like disaster shows where they would kind of recreate these disasters, like a boat crash or a ship sank or some shit like that. So a lot of times we would have to do water, and that was really difficult in 3D. So at one point I was like, all right, I'm going to take those 2 weeks and I'm going to try to learn how to do this thing. It's called particle simulation. And it's a way that you can actually recreate like how water reacts to things. And that's incredibly complex thing to learn. So I decided I was going to learn this thing called RealFlow, and it was like, this really expensive software, and I didn't even really know if it was going to be possible to use it. And so for that 2 weeks, I went into this completely unbalanced state where I just remember that's all I would do is work on this, because I had all of these things happening. I had a clear goal. Let's see. I had a well-defined specific goal. I was super focused. I had feedback loops. So every time you kind of got a little bit closer with it, you'd want to keep going. So I was pretty much obsessed with learning this over the course of a couple of weeks. And so the structured practice routine was pretty much like anytime I'm awake, that's what I'm doing. So I would pretty much like in the morning, I would wake up and I would just go right to my computer and pretty much just be there the whole time outside of eating and stuff like that. I would be just sitting there learning. So it wasn't a sustainable pace. And I remember I ended up getting really burned out. I got the feedback loops as I went, but I remember starting to get more and more disappointed because the stuff that I was learning was so incredibly complex that it takes a very long time to render. And it turned out that like none of my projects were going to be able to really use this, because most of the stuff that I've always done in that industry was really fast turnaround. And, it just turned out to be something that I was like, this is just outside of the reach of what we can offer our customers. And in addition, it would have costed a lot more to do this kind of stuff because it's a lot more intense. And, so the feedback loop started to get a little bit disappointing as I got further and further down. So I started getting disappointed with the idea that I'm learning all this stuff and I'm probably not going to be able to apply it. I mean, I'm still glad I did it, but like I literally did maybe like 2 projects that used it, and it was a real pain in the ass. So it wasn't sustainable. I was working like 16 hours a day or something like that, just trying to learn this thing. So pretty much most of the waking hours of my day were committed to that. And so the next bullet point is a long-term commitment. So I had a long-term commitment, but it wasn't realistic. So I ended up having to just cut it out. I guess this is a good time to add a graffiti example. So when I started doing graffiti, it was 1991. And I spent a couple of years doing the toy thing, and then, just marker tags and shit like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that was like the gist of it. And so in 93 is when I met GK, and MSK was being formed or reformed, I guess. So a whole backstory. I've probably said it before, but let's just say MSK, the current version that you're aware of, if you're aware of it, is was being created. So I started hanging around with GK and Fate and Havoc, and GK introduced me to Eklipse. This was 1993, so I was really terrible. I didn't have good hand styles. I had no throwies and all this kind of stuff. But GK and I were becoming friends, and we were starting to go painting together and going bombing together and all that stuff. So he started showing me the ways of graffiti, you know, the ins and outs. He had given me some letters, but when he introduced me to graffiti or to Eklipse gave me a sheet. I fucking wish I had this still. It was just a little sheet of paper that he drew a few things on it, you know, some tags and some letters and stuff. And he told me to practice them exactly. And so back to the bullet points, long-term commitment. I had a long-term commitment of being a reputable graffiti writer, I guess you could say, and really learning how to do this thing and become, you know, a real graffiti writer. Because at the time, I felt like I still hadn't figured out, like, what is it? What does that even mean? I'm doing graffiti, but I felt like an outsider, you know, like I don't know, like a little league baseball player looking at pros playing Major League Baseball, I guess. I don't know if that's a good example, but that's kind of what it felt like, you know, like I felt like I was just doing it, but on the outside, you know. So I wanted to be a real graffiti writer, I guess you could say. So I had that long-term commitment. The next bullet point is adaptability, and then obviously being able to make adjustments. So I'll go back into my sort of example, but these other two bullet points fit right in. So, and then the last bullet point is expert guidance. So mentors and shit like that. So that's exactly what was going on at this time. So GK was teaching me all the ins and outs of graffiti, you know, showing me the different things in the city. Cause I don't know, a lot of you might be able to relate to this. Like, do you remember what the city looked like before and what the city looked like after you became a graffiti writer? So what I mean by that is, as you start to get exposed to these different areas where graffiti writers, you know, these hot spots were, you know, like back in the 90s, like downtown LA. I mean, it is still now, but downtown LA is a lot different than it used to be. But back then, like, that was a really cool spot, South Central, different parts of LA. And so I was starting to get exposed to these areas now as somebody that's looking at it through the lens of graffiti, and you really start to see things a little bit differently. So GK was really molding me into that and teaching me all of this kind of stuff. He was telling me about, you know, different writers, you know, people that weren't really up anymore, but they kind of set the trends, or they sort of, you know, paved the way for the next generation. He was teaching me all of that kind of stuff. And Eklipse was also, but GK was a lot more hands-on because I was hanging around with him pretty much every day. So tying this back into deliberate practice. So GK is teaching me all that stuff, and then Eklipse gave me that sheet of letters. So once I got that sheet of letters, and pretty much the instruction was do them exactly like this, don't change them. You'll learn a lot from just, you know, doing these. Don't add your own stuff to it yet. Just do these exactly. My skill levels were very low at the time. So in order to draw, even though they were very simple, Eklipse is a letter master. So in order to be able to try to replicate even a simple letter some would argue that even doing simples is even more difficult than complex letters in some cases, because you can't hide any imperfections with like arrows and overlaps and all this kind of stuff. If you have a really simple letter, you know, you have to do it. It has to be really well balanced, and everything has to land where it's supposed to land, or it's going to look like shit. Like your letters are very exposed when they're simple. So in order to try to, you know, me as a total novice and not have very little skills to be able to try to replicate letters that were given to me by a master, it required all of these things that I was talking about. So to go back through the list, well-defined specific goals. I mean, it wasn't very specific, but I wanted to become, you know, a whole different level of graffiti writer or whatever. So that's not really a specific goal. It's somewhat vague, but at the same time, I don't know. It's vague, but it's not as vague as like, I just want to get better. It was like, I want to become something else. I didn't know what that was at the time though. Then in the next bullet point, focus and attentive practice. So that's when I kind of went into this mode when I had this sheet. I remember just every day, just trying to draw these letters over and over and over again, trying to get them down, every letter that he gave me. And so I did that on paper. And then once I was comfortable enough, and the next time I went painting, I would try to do those letters on the wall. And, obviously another bullet point, stepping out of my comfort zone by trying to do these new letters, obviously way out of my comfort zone. Long-term commitment, I already said that. I was already committed to being a better graffiti writer. Adaptability, I was, trying to adapt from what I was doing to what I was being taught. And then expert guidance, I was getting guided by these two guys. So I had all those things in place. And so the point of all of this, and the reason that I'm even talking about it, is I made a huge amount of progress in a very short amount of time. So I was writing from 91 until 93. So I don't remember exactly what months, but it was probably about 2.5 years before I started getting into this phase of my graffiti career. And I probably made more progress in, say, like the first 2 months of all of this than I did that whole first 2.5 years, because I had all of these things in place. Like I started to really see where my path was leading. I was hanging around with all these different writers, these AWR guys and all of the MSK guys. And just to reiterate, like, these guys aren't this is them in their coming up era, so it was like before they were super well known, and before they did all of the stuff that if you know of MSK, the MSK that you would know of was probably 10 plus years after all of this time. So unless you're, older like I am and you were watching the whole thing. But anyway, the point is, like, I had a more clear path. So in that short amount of time, I made a huge amount of progress. So it was all because of this deliberate practice and all of this stuff, in addition to the expert guidance. So the mentorship with these two guys. So if there's any skill you want to develop, or if you're at a point, and a lot of us graffiti writers or artists kind of reach this point where you feel like you're kind of stuck, you've been doing the same kind of stuff for quite a while, and you want to make a change, you can apply all of these things and intentionally apply all of these things and make a lot of progress in a short amount of time. It's going to take commitment, and it's going to take intention to do that, especially nowadays. We're in this era of like massive distractions, so it's probably a little bit more difficult. But if you apply all of these things and you do it with intention, I think you can make a lot of progress. Well, I know you can make a lot of progress in a short amount of time. So just to reiterate everything, number one, well-defined specific goals. So figure out what your outcome is, what you want to achieve with it. When you're practicing, bullet point 2, focused and attentive practice. Make sure even if it's for a half an hour or 15 minutes or whatever it is, the more focus and the more intent and just being hyper in the moment, all distractions are shut out. You're going to make a lot of progress in whatever amount of time you're putting in. Pay attention to the feedback loops. Look for the small wins that you're getting as you're starting to make that progress. So if you're trying to draw a whole new style of letters, just look for all those little wins. If you do like some arrow and you're like, oh, I've never really been able to draw an arrow quite like that. This looks really cool. Maybe that's not a good example, but that's a feedback loop. You want to look for those little wins. You may not even have to look for them. They'll just pop up. Stepping outside of your comfort zone. Obviously, the whole example is if you want to change your style or you want to learn a new skill or any of that kind of stuff, that's exactly what you're doing. You're outside of your comfort zone. You're trying to push yourself in a new direction. Structured practice routines. We're all busy. So if you have a hard time keeping those commitments to yourself, like a lot of people will say, oh yeah, I want to do this, but then they never they never actually do it. They're waiting for the time to be right. So if you just put that shit in your calendar or make a commitment, I'm going to work for this long on this day, that could be very helpful. Sustainability, I mean, I don't know. I don't know why that's even in here. I mean, I do, but I don't think on those terms, I just go all in on whatever. So, I mean, if you are the kind of person that tends to be prone to burnout, maybe just consider, what the level of intensity you're going for. And is it sustainable? Long-term commitment is another one. That goes back to the very beginning. Like, what's your goal? What are you trying to get out of it? And are you committed to whatever the long-term, are you committed to whatever it's going to take long-term, I don't know. I jumbled that all up. Anyway, adaptability, that goes back to getting out of your comfort zone. You have to be adaptable in order to get out of your comfort zone. So that's pretty obvious. If you're doing that, you're already sort of exercising adaptability. So just make sure you're learning as you're going and adapting to the things, the roadblocks or even the wins. You can adapt those wins and kind of like piggyback off of them. I don't know why I'm kind of all over the place with that one. So then expert guidance, if you have the ability or if you know anybody that's willing to help you. I've had a great deal of success with mentors from all different aspects of my life. Early on with the mentors, GK and Eklipse, and then all the way to now, I have mentors now in business, and I'm starting to even mentor other people in business and things like that. So it's an incredibly powerful way to shorten the timeline, avoid the mistakes. You can learn from somebody else's path, and you don't necessarily have to have a one-on-one mentor. You can find guidance in books or videos and all this kind of shit, different ways of finding that expert guidance. I mean, obviously, if you have somebody willing to pass down that knowledge one-on-one, I think that's the best way to go about it. That's pretty much it. Deliberate practice is not about putting in the time. It's about how you use that time, how focused you are on it, how goal-oriented you are, challenging yourself, all of these kind of things. So give it a try, commit to the process, and see how much you can shorten that timeline from where you are to where you want to get to. All right. Good.
Appreciate each and every one of you guys who are supporting the cause and continue to spread the love. And stay up.